Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment, as we're taking a look at, of course, the 32nd Vice President of the United States, John Nance Garner. Of course, yesterday was part 1. We took a look at the early life and then the rise in politics, the very long political career of John Nance Garner, leading all the way up to his vice presidency. So, here in part 2, we're going to take a look at that vice presidency. We're going to take a look at his legacy, and then, of course, his death and his gravesite and burial site there in Uvalde, Texas, and the very, very funny story of my visit to his gravesite in Texas. So, we're going to get into all that here in this part 2. So I am flying solo, so let's just jump right in. Part 2, next Vice Presidential Series installment, the 32nd Vice President, John Nance Garner. Here we go. The election of 1932. A Garner for President movement emerged in January of 1932, instigated by an editorial campaign in the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst. It was independent of any initiative or encouragement by Garner over such other prospective nominees as Franklin Roosevelt, Al Smith, and former Secretary of War Newton Baker. Hearst endorsed Garner as the candidate he considered most likely to adhere to his own agenda, which included instituting a national sales tax and keeping the United States out of the League of Nations. The Garner bandwagon included many conservative Southern and Western politicians who felt ideologically and personally comfortable with Garner. A contemporary journalist attributed the attraction of the Garner candidacy to the desire of the rank-and-file Democrats to get away from everything the East implies and to find a good, safe politician with an innocuous record. What they want is a Democratic Coolidge. Others supported Garner only as a stalking horse for another candidate or as one of a variety of candidates whose delegates could collectively block Roosevelt. Garner himself was less interested in becoming president than in ensuring his tenure as Speaker by nominating a candidate who could capture the White House with long enough coattails to solidify the party's majority in Congress. Roosevelt's candidacy, he concluded, was the best bet to unite and strengthen the party enough to achieve this goal. Garner, therefore, ignored the efforts of his promoters and refused to proclaim himself as a candidate, although he never actually ordered them to desist. As a consequence, Garner found himself holding a tiger by the tail at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where he placed third on the first ballot behind Roosevelt and Smith. After 3 ballots, during which Garner's numbers increased marginally, Roosevelt strategists realized that without Garner's support, they would never achieve the necessary 2/3 vote that the party's century-old rule mandated for nomination. They feared they were about to lose the Mississippi delegation, which operated under a rule that gave all 20 of its votes to the candidate favored by a simple majority of its members. To break the impasse, Roosevelt campaign manager James Farley called Garner's campaign manager, Representative Sam Rayburn, to a meeting in Mississippi Senator Pat Harrison's hotel room. So they met in Senator Pat Harrison's hotel room, did Farley and Rayburn. They agreed to ask Garner to transfer his delegates to Roosevelt in return for the vice presidential nomination. Garner reluctantly agreed in order to avoid the type of deadlock convention that in 1924 had produced the unsatisfying compromise candidacy of John W. Davis and his losing campaign. Garner consoled himself with the thought that the apparently less demanding office might be a nice way for me to taper off my career. Roosevelt wanted to use Garner's homespun appeal in extensive campaigning as a sort of Texas Al Smith. But Garner refused, believing that such efforts would be irrelevant since he regarded elections as merely a referendum on the incumbent's performance. He made only 2 speeches and was briefly employed as Roosevelt's peacemaking mediator to Smith before being dismissed to go home to Uvalde. There, he was reelected to his House seat on the same day he was elected Vice President of the United States. Between the November 1932 election and the March 1933 inauguration, Roosevelt frequently phoned Garner in Uvalde, Texas, to solicit his opinions about proposals for legislation and organizing the new government. Although Garner offered relatively few legislative proposals, he did advocate government guarantees of banking deposits, an idea he promoted in Congress despite the objections of the president-elect. Eventually, the groundswell of congressional support for the plan won Roosevelt over, and he endorsed the Vandenberg Amendment to the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, of course known as the FDIC. In this case, Garner appeared to be ahead of the New Deal curve, belying his later reputation as an inflexible reactionary. Inauguration Day in 1933 marked a ceremonial demonstration of mutual affection and gratitude between the outgoing speaker and his House colleagues as the procession of 400 House members and another 150 members-elect escorted Garner through the Capitol to the Senate chamber, where he thanked them with an emotional farewell speech in which he grieved, "My heart will always be in the House." Backed by publisher William Randolph Hearst, Garner was a serious presidential contender in the spring of 1932. Although the speaker did not campaign actively, he controlled the crucial votes of California and Texas by the time the Democrats convened in Chicago. When it became apparent by the convention's third ballot that Cactus Jack had no chance for the nomination, he released his delegates to Roosevelt. Indebted to Garner and to the state of Texas, Roosevelt offered the speaker the vice presidential nomination, which Garner reluctantly accepted. "Hell, I'll do anything to see the Democrats win one more national election," he told his friend and colleague Sam Rayburn. On November 8th of 1932, as the regionally and ideologically balanced Roosevelt-Garner ticket carried 42 of the 48 states, the new vice president also regained his seat in the House. Though in theory, he had a choice in the matter of which office to accept, in actuality, he had none. He resigned from Congress on March 4th of 1933 and began his 8-year tenure as vice president. Upon assuming the office, he described for the press the nature of its power, or its lack thereof. The vice president has no offices to bestow or favors to extend. He can only make power for himself, sometimes by his personality and ability. Only if by his association with men they come to have friendship for him and faith in and respect for his judgment can be influential. Understanding well the limitations of the office, perhaps, no holder was ever in such a good position to maximize its potential. Though the role was new, it was still familiar, and few could equal the capacity of John Nance Garner for making friends or for commanding the respect of his peers. The Board of Education moved to the Senate side of the Congress along with Garner, and 20% of the body he now presided over contained men who had served with him in the House. Astutely, Roosevelt assigned Garner to serve as his liaison with Congress and requested that as such the vice president also attend cabinet meetings. Concerned about potential resentment in the Senate, Garner accepted the offer under the conditions that he would not make public statements or recommendations for public office or national policy unless asked to do so. Not only did the vice president utilize his vast legislative knowledge to push administration measures through the Senate, but he exercised as well considerable clout in the House. He maintained excellent relations with both Senate Majority Leader Joseph T. Robinson and House Speaker William B. Bankhead. Moreover, his numerous friends in the House included the powerful Texas delegation, which supplied no fewer than 8 regular committee chairmanships at any time during the New Deal years. As historian Lionel V. Patnaud explains, little New Deal legislation could go through Congress without passing through one of these committees. Garner served the president especially well during the 100 Days, a special legislative session from March 9th to June 16th of 1932 that inaugurated the New Deal and extended executive power beyond that of any previous peacetime president. He believed the emergency measures were necessary to combat the deepening economic crisis and that they had saved the country. By early 1934, however, along with many conservative businessmen and politicians, he thought that the crisis was over and that government spending should be curtailed. In October, Garner asked the president to cut down as far as possible the cost of government, and Roosevelt indicated that he would do so. Feeling pressure from both ends of the political spectrum, Roosevelt hesitated for a few months before deciding to follow the advice of other key advisors in co-opting the initiatives of the left by introducing new programs of reform. Though the vice president disagreed with the liberal measures of the second 100 Days, referring to a number of them such as the Wagner National Labor Relations Act, the Social Security Act, and the Revenue Act as plain damn foolishness, he nevertheless worked diligently and effectively during 1935 to secure their passage. At this point, his party loyalty overcame his distaste for what he believed the New Deal had become. Yet, he found it increasingly difficult to tolerate the new capitalized phrase, especially as administration officials began referring to themselves as New Dealers rather than Democrats. First term, supporting the president's program. In many respects, Garner's new job was a step down. He called the vice presidency the spare tire on the automobile of government, a no man's land somewhere between the legislative and the executive branch, and not worth a bucket of warm spit. He bemoaned the fact that the vice president had no arsenal from which to draw power, believing that only when men have friendship for him and faith in and respect for his judgment can he be influential. In the Senate, the new vice president renewed political alliances with over 20 of his former colleagues who had moved there from the House, including such influential Democratic senators as Arkansas's Joe Robinson, Mississippi's Pat Harrison, Kentucky's Alban Barkley, Virginia's Carter Glass, South Carolina's James Burns, Texas' Morris Shepard, and Maryland's Millard Tydings. These men were products of the Wilsonian progressive New Freedom movement, but by the 1930s, some of them had become the leaders of the party's conservative wing of Southern and Western Democrats who held the key committee chairmanships. Garner's vice presidency enhanced the influence of these men because he often sympathized with them in their efforts to limit the liberalism of the New Deal. Garner's familiarity with the mechanics and personalities of Congress initially proved invaluable to the new Roosevelt administration. Before committing himself to the innovative experiments of his brains trust, Roosevelt asked for Garner's realistic assessment of congressional reaction. After observing Garner in cabinet meetings, Roosevelt's Postmaster General James Farley came to look upon him as one of the truly great public men of this generation, because of Garner's mastery of such intricate problems as government financing, taxation, tariffs, and revenue bills. Once Roosevelt decided on a new proposal, Garner acted as his political general, personally leading the White House troops as they stormed Capitol Hill. Boy, those words mean a whole lot of a different thing to us and a meaning to us these days. That sentence of personally leading the White House troops as they stormed Capitol Hill. Boy, does that sound familiar? All right, here we go. Moving on. Most of Garner's political generalship was of the guerrilla variety. He continued to host regular Bureau of Education meetings in a room near the Senate floor. Darrell St. Clair, Assistant Secretary of the Senate, remembered that the whiskey vapor would come flowing into the chamber from the formal office along with the laughter. Garner would lure guests there from both the legislative and the executive branches, ambushing them with bombardments of reason and liquor designed to hypnotize, mesmerize, and otherwise to get our friends to approve matters in a helpful way. Garner did not always agree with Roosevelt's policies during the first 100 days of the new administration, but he encouraged other reluctant lawmakers to follow him in supporting the president because it was good politics and good patriotism. Sometimes conditions in a country justify temporary violations of deep principles of government, he reasoned to one congressman. If ever there was such a time, it is now. To another Democrat who was skeptical of Roosevelt, it doesn't matter what kind of a fool you think he is. He's your fool just as long as he's president and the leader of your party. In a letter responding to criticism of the administration from a Texas lumberman friend named John Henry Kirby, he admitted, "You can't do everything you want to, and I can't do half of what I would like to do. You can't control everybody you would like to, and I am in a similar fix." One historian of the Vice Presidency rated Garner as a combination presiding officer, cabinet officer, personal counselor, legislative tactician, Cassandra, and sounding board for the administration, and undoubtedly one of the most powerful of the 20th century vice presidents. However, there were some tasks that Garner stubbornly avoided, especially those that would involve publicity, which he felt was inappropriate for a vice president. He refused to act as a spokesman for the administration because he told Roosevelt, "Any speech or statement I made would be searched to find a difference between you and me." Instead, when the press begged him for comments, he declared, "I'm a member of a firm, the junior member. Go to headquarters for the news." Just as he had in 1932, he begged out of campaigning publicly for his party in the national and statewide elections. He also declined a radio station's offer to give weekly 15-minute addresses at $1,500 each, which he thought would be exploitative of his office. Garner further absolved himself of the traditional vice presidential obligations to represent the administration at a variety of ceremonial and gala affairs. He adamantly protected his privacy and his personal time with his wife, refusing even the accompaniment of the Secret Service. "I don't want those constables protecting me. There is not anybody crazy enough to shoot a vice president," he declared. Thanks to the large Democratic majorities, Garner needed to cast a tie-breaking vote in the Senate on only 2 minor matters, but he still made his presence felt as presiding officer. One of the cagey veteran's favorite parliamentary tricks was to buggy whip bills through debate with an unexpected staccato call of "There being no objections, the bill is passed," and a sudden rap of the gavel. He also descended frequently from the dais to lobby the senators in attendance. The cantankerous Garner had little patience with the flamboyant senator from Louisiana, Huey Long. Long once asked Garner to require all of his colleagues to stay and listen to his filibuster on the National Recovery Act, to which Garner retorted, "In the first place, the senator from Louisiana should not ask that. In the second place, it would be cruel and unusual punishment." Another time he remarked to humorist Will Rogers before the convening of a session, "Will, sometimes I think the hearing in my right ear and the vision in my right eye isn't as good as it used to be. Long sits on my right. I may not be able to hear or see Huey this morning." Long antagonized Garner on another occasion by drawling, "Mr. President, I rise to make a parliamentary inquiry. How should a senator who is half in favor of this bill and half against it cast his vote?" Snapped an exasperated Garner, "Get a saw and saw yourself in two. That's what you ought to do anyway." Roosevelt's first term was not without a few points of contention between the president and his vice president, foreshadowing their later problems. Garner had grave misgivings about the National Recovery Act, diplomatic recognition of Russia, and the embargo clause in the Neutrality Act. Roosevelt was somewhat dissatisfied with Garner's choices when the Senate authorized him to select one member to the London Economic Conference in 1933, and 3 to the Nye Munitions Industry Investigation Committee. The president also suspected that Garner had botched his plan to slip the Soldiers' Bonus Bill of 1935 through Congress by leaking the strategy to his congressional friends. At the 1936 Democratic National Convention in Pittsburgh, the cumbersome 1832 rule requiring that 2/3 of all delegates approve both the presidential and vice presidential nominations was overturned in favor of a simple majority. The rules change enabled future Democratic presidential nominees to choose their own running mates, rather than accept the consensus of the convention. Initiated by Roosevelt, this reform was passed largely in deference to his personal prestige. Yet Garner's presence on the ticket almost must have made the delegates feel comfortable in doing so. It is difficult to imagine the same rule passing in 1940 when Roosevelt offered as his running mate Henry Wallace, a less popular man within the party, who would not likely have been approved under the former rules. Second term, an obstacle to Roosevelt. The second term of the Roosevelt-Garner administration saw the breakdown of the working relationship between the president and vice president. Garner objected to Roosevelt's determination to escalate the New Deal's centralizing of the federal government, expanding government regulation and spending programs, and revolutionizing the Democratic Party. The first issue over which the two men had a truly acrimonious dispute was Roosevelt's labor agenda. Garner objected to such New Deal pro-labor legislation as the Wagner-Connery Act of 1935 and the Black-Connery Act of 1937. He fiercely opposed organized labor's 1936 sit-down strikes, considering them a violation of business owners' property rights. When the president proved reluctant to repudiate these tactics, Garner secretly lobbied Congress in support of efforts by Texas Representative Martin Dies Jr. and South Carolina Senator James Burns to pass congressional resolutions condemning the strikes. When Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan gave a ringing speech on the floor of the Senate in support of Burns's amendment, Garner jumped down from his presiding seat to offer his congratulations. On February 5th of 1937, Roosevelt called Garner and a handful of Democratic congressional leaders to a meeting at the White House, where he stunned them with an audacious plan to reorganize the Supreme Court. Up to 6 new justices would be chosen by the president in an attempt to ensure many years of judicial approval for his liberal legislative agenda. Garner himself was not among those critics who considered the proposal to be a threat to the judiciary's independence, believing that no president can control that court. However, he was deeply concerned about the threat to party unity posed by Roosevelt's somewhat reckless method of handling such a controversial proposal. Garner complained that the president sent the plan to Congress without notice after saying he had no legislative program other than outlined. It was not in the party platform, nor was it taken after consultation with congressional leaders who would have to put it through. Party policy is not made by one man without consultation with elected officials from another branch of government. While never issuing a public statement against the bill, Garner demonstrated his disapproval with two symbolic gestures. First, he held his nose and gave an emphatic thumbs down sign as the bill was introduced on the floor of the Senate. Then, during the subsequent congressional debate, Garner suddenly departed from the Capitol in June to return to Texas. It was the first time he had left Washington while Congress was in session. Roosevelt was furious. "Why in hell did Jack have to leave at this time for?" he fumed. "This is a fine time to jump ship." In response to widespread speculation in the press about a rift between the president and himself, Garner issued a public statement from Texas declaring that his departure was in no way meant as a protest. "I asked the boss," he claimed, "and he told me it was all right for me to go fishing." Garner eventually returned to Washington, but the death of Senate Democratic Majority Leader Joseph Robinson in July of 1937 mortally wounded Roosevelt's court proposal. The faithful Robinson had tenaciously led the fight for the bill on the president's behalf. After his passing, Roosevelt assigned that task to the unenthusiastic Garner. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's intervention to help loyal New Dealer Alben Barkley succeed Robinson as majority leader provoked resentment from many senators as well as the vice president. When the Judiciary Committee reduced Roosevelt's court-packing plan to the point where it became unrecognizable, Roosevelt was convinced that Garner had collaborated with the opposition. For his part, Garner blamed Roosevelt for antagonizing the Senate by interfering in its internal affairs. Neither man completely trusted the other again. Roosevelt and Garner had fundamentally different styles and philosophies of governing. Garner was a strict traditionalist in his attitudes toward party affairs and a strict and unbending constructionist in his literal interpretations of the constitutional doctrine of separation of powers. He was a staunch defender of the sovereignty of the legislature from undue interference by the executive. Citing the low-key approach of Calvin Coolidge as a model, he once stated, "My belief has always been in executive leadership, not executive rulership." Roosevelt, in contrast, used the powers of the presidency to set the agenda of his party and the tone of the legislative debate. Under Roosevelt, the White House increasingly issued preemptive public announcements to marshal public support to gain political leverage. Garner objected to Roosevelt that this threatened to jeopardize the legislative program by giving out premature information. He complained privately that Roosevelt wanted too much power. "He has changed in office. He does not delegate. His nature is to want to do everything himself." Despite his misgivings, the landslide Democratic victory of 1936 was immensely satisfying to the vice president. Remembering the overwhelming Republican victories of the 1920s, when some thought that the Democratic Party had outlived its usefulness, Garner took great pleasure in the vast majorities his party now realized in both the Senate and the House, and also in the number of governorships and state legislatures that Democrats controlled. The new federal government's duty, as he saw it, was to amend, amend, amend. "We have passed a lot of experimental legislation," he stated, "and any experimental legislation has to be amended in the light of the experience with it. We are not putting out a fire now. The lopsided victory only served to fuel the president's arrogance. However, and as the administration moved further to the left, the differences between the president and the vice president grew. Their inevitable split came not long after the historic 1936 election. The first significant fissure appeared because of disagreements between Roosevelt and Garner on how to handle the sit-down strikes that closed the automotive industry at the end of 1936. New Deal initiatives that protected the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively had provided new impetus to a moribund labor movement. And by 1936, the Committee for Industrial Organization, led by John L. Lewis, had begun major organization drives in the automobile and steel industries. Late in the year, automobile workers in Detroit adopted the sit-down strike, in which they refused to leave the shop until they were granted collective bargaining. Though Roosevelt disagreed with the method, he refused to denounce the strikers, whose right to unionize the Wagner Act protected. Garner, on the other hand, saw sit-down strikes as illegal. They permitted men to take over other people's property, he recalled protesting in a cabinet meeting. In Texas, we would call that stealing, he said. In January of 1937, the president and the vice president exchanged heated words over the sit-down strikes, and thereafter, Garner worked behind the scenes to oppose his boss. The ever-widening rift became irreparable during the fight over the president's court reform plan. Thwarted by a Supreme Court that had by 1936 ruled against New Deal laws in 7 of 9 major cases, Roosevelt sought to rectify the problem by naming as many as 50 new federal judges, including 6 Supreme Court justices, and by limiting the power of judges who had served 10 or more years or reached the age of 70. Though Congress had the power to determine the size of the court, the president had not consulted that body before introducing the bill, which its elder statesmen, as well as the vice president, considered an affront. Garner eventually worked out a compromise that added no new judges, but his vacation to Uvalde, Texas, in the midst of the struggle, publicized the split not only between Garner and Roosevelt, but also between the liberals and the conservatives within the party. Roosevelt's unsuccessful efforts in 1938 to purge from Congress the senators and representatives who had opposed him by campaigning against them in their district primaries exasperated the divisions within the administration. By 1938, Garner was the second most powerful man in Washington and the leader of conservative opposition to the New Deal that voted against nearly all of the president's congressional initiatives. In that year, the Texas State Democratic Convention endorsed Garner as a candidate for president in 1940, as did the Texas legislature in March of 1939. Opinion polls showed him to be the leading candidate if Roosevelt did not run. And in June, a Garner for President campaign committee formed. Purging the party. By 1938, the president was sufficiently frustrated by the conservative Democrats in Congress to attempt a purge of the party. He embarked on a campaign through southern and western states to endorse liberal candidates in primary challenges to such conservative incumbents as Senators Millard Tydings of Maryland, Walter George of Georgia, and Guy Gillette of Iowa, or maybe Guy Gillette. Garner argued to Roosevelt that his intervention in local elections was an unfair invasion of a local politician's own constituency and his own orbit, and could only provoke resentment from voters who would regard it as presidential arrogance. He warned Roosevelt, "You can't defeat the Southern Democrats, and if you defeat the Democrats in the North, you will get Republicans instead." This prediction proved true, as the November elections resulted in the Republicans gaining 81 House and 8 Senate seats. Although only one of Roosevelt's primary election targets, Representative John J. O'Connor of New York City, lost, several of Garner's close friends in the Senate, including Connecticut's Augustine Lornigan, New Hampshire's Fred Brown, and Wisconsin's Francis Duffy, were among the Democratic casualties in the general elections. Roosevelt then further insulted conservatives by appointing to key administrative posts several New Dealers who had been defeated in the elections. Garner lamented to Postmaster General James Farley that Roosevelt had stirred up a hornet's nest by entering into the primary fights. There are now 20 men, Democrats, in the Senate who will vote against anything he wants. In 1939, Congress denied virtually everything Roosevelt requested, including an undistributed profits tax, government reorganization, increased funding for the Works Progress Administration, and revision of the neutrality laws. Convinced that the crisis of the Depression was essentially over and that continued relief programs threatened to create a complacently dependent lower class, Garner considered it time to roll back some of the regulatory legislation and pump priming expenditures that had been passed for emergency relief during the first term. Privately, Garner confided his suspicions of several ardent New Dealers in the Roosevelt Brains Trust. "I am not worried about the boss. It's the people around him. I have no confidence in them." Another time, Garner claimed, "I have more honest affection for him, Roosevelt, in my little finger that they have in their whole bodies." This hostility was mutual. The New Dealers were contemptuous of Garner's conservatism and his occasionally coarse behavior, and disdained his somewhat shady style of old-fashioned backroom horse trading. Identifying Garner as a convenient scapegoat for Roosevelt's frustrations in guiding his agenda through Congress, liberals within the administration launched assaults to discredit his character. Harold Ickes, writing in a June 1939 issue of Look magazine, accused Garner of a traitorous knifing in the back of the commander-in-chief. The coming 1940 presidential election sparked the final break. Garner claimed that at the inauguration ceremony in 1937, he and the president had taken a mutual pledge to retire at the end of that term. As tumultuous events unfolded abroad, however, it became increasingly apparent that Roosevelt intended to run for an unprecedented third term, arguing that the volatility of the international situation made his presence indispensable. In December of 1939, Garner announced that, while he would not actively campaign, he would not reject the presidential nomination if he were offered it at the 1940 convention. regardless of whether Roosevelt chose to retire or run again. He thus became the first vice president of the modern era to challenge his own chief executive for the office. Garner admitted that his passive candidacy was hopeless if Roosevelt really wanted to be reelected, and that he would be happy to retire to Uvalde. But his opposition to a third term motivated him to join the Stop Roosevelt movement. He considered himself the only candidate with a chance of attracting enough support to convince the president to retire. During the last 2 years of Roosevelt's second term, Garner was the consistent frontrunner among the possible successors to Roosevelt in public opinion polls, although the public rarely got to observe Jack Garner's actions directly. What they did know about him, or at least what they thought they knew, captured their imagination. His wheeler-dealer image, self-made wealth, and free market convictions made him a symbol of the emerging business age. At the same time, as a rugged, individualistic frontiersman, he was a nostalgic throwback to a vanishing age, a reassuringly simple figure in an increasingly complex world. It was obvious to all that Cactus Jack had earned his nickname because he was a hardy survivor with a tough hide, stumpy stature, prickly disposition, and deep Texas roots. Conservative congressmen praised Garner to their favorite reporters. The press, in turn, was usually eager to carry good copy about the legendary cowboy vice president who rode herd on Washington and plotted in the cloakrooms. Complained one contemporary critic, the newspaper men have never lost an opportunity to apotheosize his mediocrity. Despite this buildup, Roosevelt correctly doubted that Garner possessed enough ambition or standing to mount a serious challenge in 1940. Yet Garner believed Roosevelt resented the press attention that was often lavished on his vice president. Postmaster General James Farley noted that Roosevelt sometimes seemed quick to blame Garner for the administration's legislative failures, and that the president did not like to see the trees grow too tall around him. Hitler's offensive across Western Europe in 1940 and the patriotic rallying around the president that the crisis inspired effectively precluded any challenge to Roosevelt's nomination. He was renominated on the first ballot at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago with the votes of 946 delegates. Farley and Garner were far behind with 72 and 61 votes, respectively. Not only did Garner not campaign for Roosevelt, he could not even bring himself to vote in the 1940 election. He went home to Uvalde, Texas, where he lived in retirement until his death at the age of 98, 27 years later. The concept of a third term for any president was anathema to Garner. I would be against a third term on principle, even if I approved every act of Roosevelt's 2 terms, he told Bascom Timmons. I would oppose my own brother for a third term. If Roosevelt was ever undecided about whether or not to run, his path became clearer as Garner gained momentum. He was certainly not going to allow a successor to undo all that he had accomplished. Believing that Roosevelt's third-term campaign was inevitable, Garner declared his candidacy for the presidency in December of 1939, 3 months after Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. It was the first time since the development of the party system that a sitting president and a vice president competed for their party's nomination. Crushed in the primaries by the presidential machine, Cactus Jack Garner ended his campaign at the Chicago Convention in July of 1940 when Roosevelt received the Democratic nomination with Henry A. Wallace as his running mate. Roosevelt defeated Republican nominee Wendell L. Willkie in the fall election by a comfortable margin, as Garner retired from public life to his home in Uvalde, Texas. He lived there quietly until his death on November 7th of 1967, a couple of weeks before his 99th birthday. In 1965, when asked by a Washington journalist for suggestions on running the government, he admonished, "Stop the spending." Garner's vice presidential legacy is mixed. While he played a major role in implementing Roosevelt's programs during the first term, he might also be held accountable for preventing completion of the New Deal. His entire career, however, serves as a testament to the importance of legislative power. As vice president, he resisted the transfer of power from the legislative to the executive branch that occurred during his tenure. A colorful character who always provided good copy for the journalists, Garner is perhaps most often recalled for his widely misquoted statement that the office of vice president was not worth a pitcher of warm spit. He actually said piss. After his first term, he said, "The job is delightful. I like it, but it is almost entirely unimportant." Although he had little regard for the office, some historians, such as Lionel V. Patnaud, have called him the most powerful vice president in the history of the United States. Conclusion. Years after his retirement from politics, Garner mused that the country might have benefited more had he retained the speakership and used it to check the growth of Franklin Roosevelt's ambitions and powers in much the way Speaker Cannon had restrained Theodore Roosevelt. I think I could have talked him out of a lot of the things. That could have been my contribution. I would have had no desire to dictate his decisions, Garner told Baskin Timmons, his newspaper correspondent biographer. But there would have been times when I would have told him what he could not do. In a 1957 interview, Garner lamented, "If I hadn't been nominated for vice president, I might still be speaker today." This claim does not seem far-fetched, given Garner's relish for the position, his robust health, and the preservation of a Democratic majority in the House for all but 2 Congresses during the rest of his long life. The memory of his sour second term with Garner encouraged Roosevelt to redefine drastically what he was looking for in a vice president in 1940. Henry Agard Wallace was in many ways the antithesis of Garner. As vice president, Wallace was without either the inclination or access to make his own clandestine alliances and deals that might undermine the president's authority. While Garner was a parochial thinker with isolationist convictions, Wallace was fascinated with foreign affairs and peoples and entertained ideas about how Americans could help solve their problems. An administrator rather than a politician like Garner, Wallace lacked legislative experience and extensive party ties. To some degree, Wallace resembled the corporate vice president that Roosevelt had advocated in 1920, who could handle matters of detail. The Vice Presidency of John Nance Garner stands as a watershed in the evolution of the office. His first term marked the apex of the parliamentarian as Vice President. His second term represented its nadir. Perhaps no other Vice President had as much impact, both positive and negative, on the legislative efforts of his administration. Garner was a specialist in an office that would soon require generalists. He was the last Vice President whose duties were primarily legislative. Garner was also the last of the largely silent Washington-based vice presidents before the coming of age of modern telecommunications and travel enabled future vice presidents to assume higher profiles as representatives of their administrations, as wide-ranging campaigners, public spokesmen, and foreign emissaries. During his first term, Garner may have made a more valuable and positive contribution to his administration than any of his predecessors, but his actions in the second term did more to undermine the administration than those of any vice president since John C. Calhoun. Chosen to balance the ticket in 1932, Garner felt obligated to use all of the formal and informal powers of his office to protect the interests of the party's conservative wing that had, against his better judgment, moved him from Speaker to Vice President. So some more of just fun things about Garner. I didn't even know this. I read this later on. Garner was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1898 and reelected in 1900. We knew that from part one. During his service, the legislature selected a state flower for Texas. Garner fervently supported the prickly pear cactus for the honor, and thus earned him the nickname Cactus Jack. It was actually the blue bonnet that was actually named the state flower, but pretty interesting. That's how he supposedly got his nickname of Cactus Jack. I thought that was pretty cool. So let me see some more things here. Garner left office on January 20th of 1941, ending a 46-year career in public life. He retired to his home in Uvalde, Texas, for the last 26 years of his life, where he managed his extensive real estate holdings, spent time with his great-grandchildren, and fished. Throughout his retirement, he was consulted by active Democratic politicians and was especially close to Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman. On the morning of Garner's 95th birthday, November 22nd of 1963, President John F. Kennedy called to wish him a happy birthday. This was just hours before Kennedy's assassination. Dan Rather states that he visited the Garner Ranch that morning to film an interview with Garner where Miss Texas Wool was in attendance, and that he then flew back to Dallas from Uvalde to deposit the film at then CBS affiliate KRLD-TV. Garner died on November 7th of 1967 at the age of 98 years and 350 days. He is interred in Uvalde Cemetery. Garner is the longest living vice president in U.S. history, a distinction which was previously held by Levi P. Morton, who was 96 when he died. Actually, on his 96th birthday, Levi P. Morton. Garner and Schuyler Colfax, vice president under Ulysses S. Grant, are the only two vice presidents to have been Speaker of the House of Representatives prior to becoming vice president. As the vice president is also the president of the Senate, Garner and Colfax are the only people to have served as the presiding officer of both houses of Congress. The popular Garner State Park, located 30 miles north of Uvalde, bears his name, as does Garner Field, just east of Uvalde. The women's dormitory at Southwest Texas Junior College in Uvalde bears his wife's name. John Garner Middle School, located in San Antonio's Northeast Independent School District, is also named after him. And the John Nance Garner Museum is also there in Uvalde, Texas. So I wasn't going to read this whole thing, but it's actually a pretty darn good article, and I am going to read it. So take a listen here about this article I found very fun and interesting about Garner. Not worth a bucket of warm spit. When it comes to commentary about the office of Vice President of the United States, no statement is more repeated than John Nance Garner's observation that the Vice Presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit. Garner's statement is part of the lexicon of studies on the Vice Presidency. The crusty, sharp-tongued Texan, known during his lifetime as Cactus Jack, built his reputation on biting commentary and one-liners. But regarding the bucket matter, did Garner really say what everyone thinks he said? If so, who first heard the story, and when does it appear in print? And did Garner actually hold this view, or did he have a more analytical view of the office that stood second in line to the presidency? John Nance Garner, one of the most famous political figures in the 20th century American history, served as the nation's 32nd vice president for 2 terms. As FDR's vice president, he transformed the position from a non-entity and political dustbin into a pinnacle of power in the legislative and executive branches. Prior to his 2 terms with FDR, Garner built a remarkable career in the House of Representatives. Elected from the sprawling district in the brush country of southern Texas along the border with Mexico, he first went to the House of Representatives in 1902. He rose in seniority and influence until becoming Speaker of the House in 1931. Recognizing his power and influence, FDR selected Garner to join the 1932 Democratic Party ticket. And now I'm skipping ahead a little bit in this article because it just goes over stuff we really discussed at length in this episode. So, with Americans reeling under the weight of the Great Depression, Roosevelt won the 32 Democratic Party nomination and quickly began the search for a vice president. According to news accounts of the 1932 Democratic Convention, a number of prominent contenders were under consideration as Roosevelt's running mate. But most of these presidential aspirants believed serving as vice president offered a one-way ticket to political oblivion. Arthur Bugs Bear, a Washington Herald newsman covering the Democratic Convention in Chicago, wrote, "It just seems like nobody wants to be vice president." In a June 30th, 1932 story, Bear revealed that any number of Democratic senators, governors, and prominent party members publicly disdain any interest in the number 2 position. In perhaps his first public comments about the vice presidency, Speaker Garner commented, "I don't intend to spend the next 4 years counting the buttons on another man's coattails." Buttons, but no buckets. The earliest reference to the bucket quote came many years later from R.G. Tugwell, a prominent agriculture economist, an FDR supporter, and author of the 1968 book, The Brains Trust. Tugwell wrote that he first heard the famous version soon after Garner's accepted the nomination. "I can still hear Roosevelt's guffaw when he was told the Speaker's opinion of the office. It was, the Texan said, not worth a quart of warm spit." Tugwell undoubtedly believed the remark could be attributed to Garner, as he described the veteran politician as shrewd narrow, vulgar, and Philistine. If Garner delivered the infamous bucket statement in the summer of 1932, the statement never appeared in the news coverage on the nomination through the 1932 election and the nomination of Roosevelt and Garner in March of 1933. During the 2 terms he served as vice president, Garner undoubtedly expressed opinions about being second fiddle to Maestro Roosevelt. But for the most part, his comments never appeared in press. In a front-page story entitled Cactus Jack Talks About Poker, Socks, in the Seattle Daily Times on October 15th of 1935, Garner delivered his official position. "Boys," he said, "I'm deaf, blind, and dumb as far as politics is concerned. I'm like a soldier. I do as I'm told. But since the day I was elected vice president, I've said nothing." He maintained his public posture with the press. As the New York Times quoted the vice president during the Roosevelt-Garner re-election campaign on June 27th of 1936, "Our firm has 2 members. The senior member does all the talking, and I do all the work." In spite of his self-imposed embargo on public pronouncements, Garner's reputation for earthy language and cryptic remarks remained intact. In an extended feature story in Country Gentleman magazine in May of 1939, E.H. Taylor noted that the vice president retained his candor and saltiness of expression. After nearly 40 years in Washington, Garner still enjoyed the simple life of a small-town banker and Texas rancher. "You don't have to remove any rind to get at the meat of what he says," Taylor stated. The author quoted another journalist who stated that Garner provided a number of gleeful, disrespectful, unprintable, but endearing epithets couched in the rich vernacular of the Southwest. So then the article talks about how he was going up against Roosevelt in 1940. He lost, and how Garner retired to his home in Uvalde, Texas. And it says, every major daily newspaper in the nation covered his departure from Washington. Many journalists wrote of Garner's political influence, his extensive career, and his controversial personality. No story contained any reference to the vice presidency and the bucket. Spurning all efforts to write his memoirs and rejecting offers to transfer his papers to the University of Texas, Garner burned nearly all of his correspondence and records. He apparently moved the collection to the yard behind his back porch and used the historic documents for his own personal bonfire. Newspapers throughout the nation carried the sad story of the destruction of irreplaceable records on July 6th of 1947. Thus, any definitive written correspondence from Garner that may have contained the bucket story went up in smoke. Nevertheless, on numerous occasions, journalists would make the trek to Texas to take the pulse of Cactus Jack and listen to his views on national affairs. He also provided some commentary about the vice president's job. In an interview with Collier's magazine in the March 20th, 1948 edition, Garner said, "There cannot be a great vice president. A great man may occupy the office, but there is no way for him to become a great vice president because the office in itself is almost wholly unimportant." In 1957, Garner told... Hold on, I lost my spot there. Hold on one sec. I apologize. Here. In 1957, Garner told local author Florence Fenley, "When I was elected vice president of the United States, it was the worst thing that ever happened to me." The reporter and author most closely connected to Garner was fellow Texan Baskin Timmons. Timmons remained one of Garner's closest friends and served as his spokesman at the 1940 Democratic Convention. In his 1948 book, Garner of Texas, Timmons quoted Garner as stating the vice presidency was a no man's land somewhere between the legislative and executive branch. He also said that the vice president has no arsenal from which to draw power. Timmons held numerous interviews with Garner and followed him for years in Washington and in Texas. Garner may have provided the bucket quote to Timmons, but the author wanted his biography to place Garner in the best possible light and to present him as an elder statesman. So Timmons never used the bucket story in his life story of the former vice president. Timmons also avoided some of Garner's other jaded expressions as part of his effort to enhance Garner's legacy. The bucket of warm spit resurfaces in connection with the 1960 presidential election. In Sam Johnson's Boy, Alfred Steinberg's biography of Lyndon Johnson, the author recounted the turmoil surrounding the 1960 Democratic Convention and Lyndon Johnson's decision to become JFK's running mate. Following JFK's victory as the Democratic presidential nominee, LBJ gathered with Speaker Sam Rayburn and his friends in his hotel suite to ponder the offer of the vice presidency. One phone call went to Garner in Uvalde, Texas. Garner reportedly told Johnson, "I'll tell you, Lyndon, the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit." Journalist Theodore White noted the same episode in The Making of the President, 1960. White's 1961 bestseller remains one of the highly regarded studies of the 1960 presidential election. White revealed the uncertainty in the Johnson camp over accepting JFK's offer to join the ticket. From his suite in the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, Johnson telephoned Garner at his home in Uvalde. White reported Garner's remarks to LBJ. "I'll tell you, Lyndon," Garner surmised, "the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit." Any other advice from Garner went unrecorded. Shortly thereafter, bucket or not, LBJ accepted Kennedy's offer. One of the first newspaper stories that contained the bucket of warm spit anecdote appeared in the Los Angeles Times on April 1st of 1962. In an article on Richard Nixon's 1962 book, Six Crises, Marvin Side wrote, "The vice presidency," John Nance Garner once confided to fellow Texan Lyndon Johnson, "isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit." White's popular book on the 1960 presidential election undoubtedly helped circulate the bucket episode to a national audience. The story certainly seemed appropriate to Nixon, who served as Eisenhower's vice president and spent much of his 2 terms chafing under the war hero president. Nixon's book was his attempt to begin a political comeback after his 1960 presidential loss to the Kennedy-Johnson team. When Garner passed away on November 7, 1967, a few days short of his 99th birthday, tributes poured in from across the nation. The New York Times on November 8th of 1967 carried an extensive story on Garner's record and his influence. They noted one of his comments on the vice presidency in the story: "A spare tire of the government." Garner was also quoted as saying, "Worst damn fool mistake I ever made was letting myself be elected vice president of the United States." But no mention of the bucket quote appeared in print. In the many tributes given to him on his death, the state's newspaper reporters recounted many personal encounters and humorous quotes from Garner. Texas Congressman O.C. Fisher, who later wrote a biography of Garner, told the Dallas Morning News on November 8th of 1967 that his fellow Texan was fond of saying, "When I switched from Speaker to Vice President, it was the only demotion I ever had." Representative Fisher delivered the announcement of Garner's death to the House of Representatives on Tuesday, November 7th of 1967. In homage to Garner and his legacy, every major daily newspaper in Texas ran news articles and editorials about Garner. The Houston Post on November 8th of 1967 related the story that he told to a circus clown. "I am Vice President of the United States. You'd better stick around a while. You might pick up some new ideas." San Antonio Light reporter Tom McGowan wrote in his farewell that Garner had referred to being elected vice president as the worst mistake in my life, and repeated the reference to Garner's assertion that the office was the spare tire of government. Reviewing the many and varied stories in the Texas newspapers, the story of the bucket of warm spit never appears in any of the news articles, commentaries, or editorials at the time of Garner's death. However, the national news magazines began to use the bucket quote after Garner's death. In the Time magazine obituary of November 17, 1967, the article stated, "Plain spoken to the last, he always regretted having given up his speaker's role for the vice presidency, which he said wasn't worth a pitcher of warm spit." In the O.C. Fisher biography published in 1978, the author repeated that Garner had stated that the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. In reality, Fisher maintained that Garner had really said that the office isn't worth a pitcher of warm piss. Fisher's fig leaf approach left it clear that Garner probably used more descriptive terms that some would consider profane. Fisher claimed that Garner told him, "Those panty-waist writers wouldn't print it the way I said it." While Garner's death in 1967, the bucket of warm spit quote began to appear more frequently in magazines and newspapers. The story appeared with some regularity every 4 years, where one or both of the presidential nominees faced the decision of selecting a vice president. Given Garner's reputation and his oft-quoted remarks about the vice presidency, there is little doubt that he used the bucket of warm spit reference. And as one biographer noted, he probably said warm piss. That would be entirely in character. When he first made the statement is debatable, but he may well have first delivered the comments around the time he accepted the vice presidency in 1932. As for reasons why the quotes seldom appeared before the 1960s, the popular media seldom used language that editors and readers may have found offensive. Sex, offensive language, and explicit violence were excised from the popular press for generations before the 1960s. Garner stated in the O.C. Fisher biography that the panty-waist reporters would not use his more graphic quotes. The journalistic standards of the era would not allow for the introduction of some of the earthy language that Garner often employed. Later generations had a broader tolerance of more graphic commentary. Although 21st century society is more tolerant of profanity and vulgarity, the news media to this day still avoid using certain four-letter words. A 2004 incident involving Vice President Dick Cheney hurling an expletive at a U.S. senator became newsworthy but difficult to report by the press. So perhaps Garner's colorful ritual of elocution has remained intact at the U.S. Capitol. In any event, given the popularity and widespread acceptance of his anecdote, John Nance Garner and the bucket of warm spit will live on in the history of political lexicon. I love it. I love the bucket of warm spit debate. I think it's, or warm piss, whatever was said. I think it's great. I think it's fabulous. So, here you go. Now, here's a few actual video clips and such of John Nance Garner. I'm not going to show you a whole lot because I know this episode's getting long, but I did want to show you at least a few minutes of some video clips of John Nance Garner. So take a look here. Video clips, 32nd Vice President John Nance Garner.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first vice president poses here with his wife in early 1930s. Yes, it's Texas Jack, more politely known as John Nance Garner. Twice elected vice president of the United States, Wiley Texan ruled Senate from 1932 through 1941.
Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that you take this obligation without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which you are about to enter, so help you God.
I do.
John Nance Garner, the consummate backroom dealmaker from small-town Texas, rose to power in Washington, becoming Speaker of the House and Vice President to Franklin D. Roosevelt. He's known as Cactus Jack.
The history of the modern vice presidency really begins with John Nance Garner, Roosevelt's legislative, the leader on Capitol Hill.
He's the unsung hero of FDR's New Deal that helped bring the country out of the Great Depression.
It was about finding the middle ground between Republicans and Democrats to craft effective public policy.
He learned how to pour stiffer drinks for them than he did for himself. Then he did his work.
Roosevelt couldn't have done it by himself. Garner couldn't have done it by himself. But the two of them working together for 8 years managed to put together this coalition that did last and really change the face of America.
The life and history of John Nance Garner, Cactus Jack, Lone Star on Capitol Hill.
President Roosevelt and Vice President Garner were together at this Washington dinner in celebration of Jackson Day. Like Christmas, it only happens once a year. And also like Christmas, it's very informal.
Brethren and sisters, I'm going to make the same speech to you tonight that I make to the Senate of the United States. It always is pleasing. And when I know it will please the President of the United States and all the balance of it. And that is to say that we dismiss you tonight until 1939 at the same hour. I bid you good night.
Garner. So then, last but certainly not least, everyone, is my visit to the Uvalde, Texas cemetery there in Uvalde, Texas, where John Nance Garner is buried. Now, the interesting thing about this and the kind of funny story that I wanted to tell is this is when I was doing all this crazy driving and all these these crazy trips back in 2020. This was actually right around the 4th of July of 2020. To be exact, just to kind of give you guys an idea, I visited John Nance Garner's grave on the 4th of July of 2020. So this is like, these travels are like around July 2nd or 3rd, leading up to the 4th of July of 2020. So I was in Oklahoma. I was in Oklahoma City, visiting the absolutely wonderful and emotional memorial and tribute at the Oklahoma City bombing site in Oklahoma City, which was amazing and breathtaking. And I'm sure I'm actually showing you a couple of my photos on the screen now to my visit there. So then I decided from Oklahoma City, I was going to drive to a very, very, very small town known as Binger, Oklahoma. Binger. Why in the heck would you go to Binger, Oklahoma? Just to give you guys an idea, I actually just looked it up. Just to give you guys an idea, the population of Binger, Oklahoma, as of 2019, so only a couple years ago, was 619 people. So yes, it's a really small town. But the reason I went there is because Hall of Fame catcher Johnny Bench, that is where he is from. He is from Binger, Oklahoma, and me being a huge baseball fan and a huge fan of the history of baseball, I went there. You're seeing some of my pictures now of my trip to Binger, Oklahoma, the booming populist, the metropolis, so to speak, of Binger. So this was like, I got there right around like sunset. So then I decided to drive from Binger toward Lubbock, Texas. So I had to go through, head west and head through the remainder of Oklahoma and then kind of make my way into Texas down to Lubbock. That travel alone was 4 hours and 47 minutes, over 300 miles, just from Binger, Oklahoma to Lubbock, Texas. So, excuse me, I hiccuped. So that was a far drive. And I remember I stopped in a place somewhere, I don't remember the exact town, but somewhere probably about an hour or so, maybe even 2 hours outside of Lubbock, north of Lubbock. So I was coming basically west across Oklahoma into Texas and then heading south down to Lubbock, Texas. This is, you can kind of see my maps and here on the screen kind of showing you. So I stopped for the night at like a Best Western or something like that, just in a town probably about 2 hours or so north of Lubbock in Texas. The next morning I decided I was getting up, and I was going to time it to where I was going to leave where I was staying and get to Lubbock right around sunrise, which I did because I wanted to visit. That's actually the home and also the gravesite of Buddy Holly, the very famous rock and roll legendary musician. That's where he was from, Lubbock, Texas. For any of you that are also familiar, Lubbock, Texas is also the home to Texas Tech University. So I wanted to go there, see the Buddy Holly stuff, and I did that. So then from Lubbock, Texas, to get to Uvalde, Texas, or I really should say the cemetery in Uvalde, is a solid 6-hour drive. It's 374 miles, close to 400 miles, and it's nothing but Texas. It's literally, you're just driving from Lubbock, you can see kind of the map here on your screen, down south 6 hours to Uvalde, which is not far from the Mexican border. And let me tell you something, this was some adventure. I went through stretches in that 6-hour drive of nothing. And when I tell you like nothingness, I legit mean nothing. I mean something like out of a movie where somebody like is stranded in the middle of a desert. That's what it was like. It was very desert-like terrain. Nothing but just flat plains as far as the eye could see. Yes, with, rolling tumbleweed and cacti out in the distance. It was quite an impressive sight. And I actually drove through this stretch about 2 hours or longer worth of, ready? No cell phone service. Keep in mind, this is 2020. This is not 20 years ago. This is not even 2 years ago yet. This is like, a year and a half or so ago. I'm a Verizon wireless customer. Probably, them and AT&T, probably two of the best coverages in the United States for cell phone. And I lost cell phone service for over 2 hours of this drive. Meaning, if I would have broke down somehow, I would have been stranded. Literally. And I'm talking like you didn't come to any sort of like little town. And I'm doing air quotes when I say town. Because the towns you did come upon were literally the size of like a little broke down gas station and maybe a little convenience store. And that was like maybe every like 80 or 90 miles you would come to something like that. There was nothing. There was literally nothing. Actually, during this drive, I'm pretty sure it was during this drive. I'm almost positive. I actually got pulled over by a Texas state trooper, or a Texas, it was maybe a local county sheriff. I was going fast. There was nobody on the road. I mean, it was a 2-lane highway, but it was me and the coyotes and the roadrunners out there. I mean, literally. There was nothing out there. But I was going fast. I think the speed limit was 75 miles an hour, and I was going around 90 miles an hour. And a cop passed me, and he turned his car around and pulled me over. And he gave me a ticket. He gave me a speeding ticket, so learned my lesson there. And I remember him saying, when he gave me the ticket, you have to mail in the payment. I couldn't even do it online. That was not set up at all in this town of Texas. I had to mail in my payment, and he said, you have to mail it to the judge back in the town you just came from. He was referring to this like, when I tell you town, I could have thrown a rock through this town. That's how small it was. But yeah, that's what he was referring to. So quite an amazing, crazy drive. And as I got closer to Uvalde, Texas, I started seeing signs that actually said, U.S. Customs, Border Patrol, border of Mexico and United States, like 170 miles or 200 miles. Like, I was getting close to Mexico. And then finally, I made my way all the way to the Uvalde Cemetery in the bustling town of Uvalde, Texas. And, I visited John Nance Garner's gravesite. And even Uvalde, that only has a population of like 16,000 people. So even Uvalde, Texas is a very small town. It's tiny. So yes, what an adventure, to say the least. It was some adventure. I mean, that, like I said, to say the least. And you're seeing a couple of my photos here from John Nance Garner's gravesite. The thing I found really striking about his gravesite, can you guys tell? I'll give you a second here to try to take a look at one of these pictures and see if you know what I'm going to say. Was, yes, not only is it in this very, very small little cemetery, it's this giant radio tower is literally like right behind John Nance Garner's gravesite. I found that pretty fascinating. So definitely an eyesore. There's no doubt. So John Nance Garner's grave is unique because of where it is located. But I must say, it's definitely not the prettiest of gravesites. It's definitely not aesthetically pleasing, to say the least. So there you go. And then, of course, there is also the John Nance Garner Museum. You're seeing a couple pictures of that right now on your screen. I did not visit the museum. First of all, it was closed because of COVID in 2020. But also, I just did not even, it wasn't even on my radar to stop there. So these photos you're seeing are not my photos. These are stock photos I found online of the John Nance Garner Museum, which is right there in Uvalde, Texas. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed this look at our 32nd Vice President of the United States, good old Cactus Jack, John Nance Garner. Stay tuned for bonus footage. You'll see all of my photos, which, there's a handful of them, of course, of my visit to his gravesite there in Uvalde. So stay tuned for those photos. And then, of course, stay tuned for next week. We're going to take a look at the 33rd Vice President of the United States. We already said who that is, right? Henry Wallace. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for all the support. Thank you for all you do. Comments, questions, subscribes, likes, everything. Please keep it coming. Can't thank you enough. Hope you enjoyed this Vice Presidential Series installment. I know it ran a little long, but I think it's worth it. Some fun stories and some entertainment here. So thank you so much, guys, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye now.